What if I told you that the right foods could actually help you turn back the clock, and the wrong foods could be really holding you back, even severely damaging your health? In today's episode, which is a part one of several, we're going to be uncovering the ingredients that can either accelerate that aging or help slow down or even reverse it. Welcome back to the Longevity Show. I'm Dr. Hillary Lynn, a Stanford-trained longevity physician. Today, we're going to reveal some powerful insights about food and ingredients to help you stay youthful and vibrant for all the years to come. Think of your body as a car. This isn't just any car. This is your dream car, the only car you will ever own. And so you're going to want to keep your dream car in pristine condition for all of your life. The fuel you put in determines how well it runs and how long it lasts. Some foods are like premium fuel, giving you that smooth, powerful ride, while others, like processed foods, refined sugars, unhealthy fats, they're like pouring sludge into the tank. You don't want your engine to be sputtering, your parts to wear out faster, or that shiny exterior to lose its luster. So just like that car, the quality of what you put into your body makes all the difference in how your body performs and how long you stay in peak health. So let's dive into some of the key processes involved with aging and how specific food choices can impact them. First up, we've got oxidative stress and inflammation. These are two big troublemakers when it comes to aging. So oxidative stress is like rust forming inside your body in every single cell. It's a slow, relentless wear and tear on your cells, and the wrong foods, such as refined sugars and trans fats, they act like accelerants, making that rust form even faster. So imagine your body aging from the inside out, much like a piece of metal left out in the rain, slowly corroding over time. And then there's inflammation. Inflammation, or inflammaging as we call it, because it's so tied to the aging process, is like a fire that just won't go out. When you eat things like processed meats, sugary snacks, refined carbs, it's like tossing more logs into the fire, making it burn hotter and longer. And this constant fire really takes a toll. It makes it harder for your body because your cells are just trying to rebuild all the time. But this inflammaging, this fire is making it hard to rebuild as it's damaging your body. There are ways to cool it down, and we're going to get into that in a later part of this episode and following ones. So this next topic may be less familiar to many people, but it's cellular senescence, what we call the aging or zombification of cells. So zombie cells are like the cells that are unwanted guests at a party. They're not productive, but they just won't leave. They're just drunk. They hang around. They're causing trouble. They're breaking your furniture, and they release harmful vibes, chemicals that lead to more inflammation and speed up the aging process, or just generally ruin the party for you. Just like in your party, you don't want this going on in your body. The good news is the buildup of these zombie cells can be influenced by what we eat. So we'll be addressing specific foods that help keep the zombie cells in check and even kick them out of the party. I also want to talk about stress resilience. Life is not without stress. No matter what you do, you will always have stress. It's like death, taxes, and stress. Stress resilience is incredibly important because we're always going to have stress. But over time, as we age, our cells gradually lose the ability to bounce back quite as well from stress. Young, flexible bodies and cells will just bend with stress. But when you become older, things become more brittle, and like a tree branch, it might snap with stress. So that's happening all the time when we're fueling ourselves with that sludge or the refined sugars and the processed foods. It makes us lose that flexibility. But by making better choices, we can keep our bodies more flexible, more bendy, and more resilient to whatever stresses life throws at us. That brings me to the topic of AGEs, our advanced glycation end products. These are harmful compounds that form when proteins or fats combine with sugar in our bodies. Imagine AGEs as sticky glue, clogs up the inner workings of your body and leads to things like wrinkles, skin aging, chronic diseases, you name it. So the more refined sugary foods and processed foods that we eat, the more AGEs we produce and the faster we age. On the bright side, we can reverse this if we make better, healthy, smart food decisions. Let's talk about the ingredients of concern. First up is saturated fats. This is a really controversial topic right now. I think in the last 5 or 10 years, we've heard a lot about fats and how they were demonized in the 80s and 90s by infamous US food pyramid. And yes, it's true, we kind of over-demonized all fats. But I want to talk about saturated fats specifically because after a lot of research, we have essentially figured out what types of fats are better or worse for you. And there's a lot of studies. This is one area that, despite all of the hype and the debate out there on social media, we actually have pretty good evidence for it. So I want to dive into it in some great detail today. This is going to take up much of this part 1, so get ready. First up, let's zoom out. What are fats? Fats are one of the 3 main macronutrients alongside with proteins and carbohydrates that our bodies need to function properly. Fats are actually a simplified term. They are compounds that are composed of molecules called fatty acids and glycerol. Glycerol is the backbone, and fatty acids, you can think of them as flags waving on a flagpole, which is the glycerol. So fatty acids are the building blocks of fats. And this is what we're mostly talking about when we casually say fats. Fatty acids can be either saturated or unsaturated. And the difference lies in the chemical structure. And I'm going to talk about this in some detail because I think it's pretty important for understanding it. Saturated fats are called saturated because they're fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. This makes them solid at room temperature. So imagine it as a parking lot where every single spot is filled. That makes the fat molecule rigid. And these fats are found in foods that you would expect to be solid fat-wise at room temperature. So butter, cheese, fatty cuts of meat, and tropical oils like coconut and palm oil. On the other hand, unsaturated fats have at least one double bond in their structure, meaning not all the spots are filled with hydrogen atoms, making them more flexible and fluid. And therefore, they're typically liquid at room temperature. So foods that you might recognize as unsaturated fats are olive oil, avocados. I know that's confusing because avocados are obviously solid fruits, but actually the oils are liquid. So think about it that way. Same thing with nuts. So nuts obviously are solid, but nut oils are liquid at room temperature. And then fatty fish. Think about when you're making fish, you don't need as much oil to cook it because it's got so much fat in it. So what does this mean for our health? It turns out that saturated fats are bad for our health because they raise LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, or the negative unhealthy lipids. So that increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases. On the other hand, unsaturated fats can help lower the LDL cholesterol and raise the HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, or the good lipid. And that promotes better heart health. Saturated fats are primarily found in animal products and in those certain tropical oils I mentioned, like the coconut oils. The structure makes them solid and rigid again, which is that affects how they behave in the body and therefore contributes to greater inflammation and greater LDL cholesterol and a greater risk of the heart disease and accelerated aging. There are so many different types of saturated fats, and understanding where they come from can help you make better decisions. Let's break it down. We've got first long chain saturated fatty acids, otherwise known as LCSFAs. These are called things like palmitic acid, which is C16-0, and stearic acid, which is C18-0. The C represents the number of carbon atoms in the fatty acid chain. So if the number is 16 right after the C, that means there's 16 carbon atoms in the fatty acid chain. And then 18 means there's 18 of them. And then the number after the colon, so when we say like 18 and then 0, that second number represents the number of double bonds. 0 means that these fatty acids are fully saturated. Again, the full parking lot, really rigid structure, solid at room temperature. And this is commonly found in animal fats like red meat, butter, full fat dairy products. And these fats are the ones that are particularly harmful when it comes to cardiovascular health and aging. So let's take a little brief detour into an analogy because I want this to really sink in. Imagine that your cell membranes are these flexible materials like hoses that you need to stay supple for nutrients and other products to pass through easily. And that's true. You want your cell membranes to be fluid. I know it seems like we're all made of solid material, but actually when you go down very, 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 very small, we actually have pretty fluid cell membranes, and that's necessary for proper function. LCSFAs integrate into these membranes almost like pouring sludge or cement into the hose, and it makes it stiff and rigid. And this makes it less able to properly function. It makes it more difficult for cells to communicate effectively because things can't pass through the membrane properly, and passageways actually stop functioning as well. The nutrients don't flow as well, communication doesn't happen. It's like a blocked roadway, and things just start to degrade and age. So this promotes inflammation and increases oxidative stress. And these are all, of course, major contributors to aging and disease. It's like turning a flexible garden hose into a rigid pipe, and you can't use it as well. Your water can't flow to where it needs to go. LCSFAs also increase the LDL cholesterol. Remember the so-called bad cholesterol or lipids, and that contributes to the buildup of plaque in your arteries. Atherosclerosis is the process where your arteries, the pipes of your body, get clogged with more and more sludge. And these restrict blood flow and increases pressure. That reduces the ability for your blood vessels to deliver things like oxygen and nutrients to your end organs, like your brain, your heart, and so forth. That leads to higher risks of things like heart attacks and strokes, or even just more minor, you can have disability because peripheral arterial disease can also lead to problems with your limbs. That's all really bad for your health, obviously, and it also all leads to accelerated aging. So now I'm going to maybe make the picture a little bit more confusing, but I'm going to walk through this really slowly. There are these types of saturated fatty acids called very long chain saturated fatty acids, VLSFAs. So some examples of these are docosahexaenoic acid, so C22-0. Again, 22 refers to the number of fatty acids in that chain, and that means it's even longer. It's 22. Remember, we were previously talking about 16 and 18. Now we're talking about 22. And then there's lignoceric acid, which is C24-0. So that's even longer than that. And these are found in pretty small quantities, but in certain foods, including some types of fish and specific plant oils. So confusingly, maybe to some listeners, these types of saturated fats have actually shown protective effects in certain studies and reduce the risk of cardiovascular diseases. These types of VLSFAs are like lubricant for your cell membranes, and they actually add oil to a hose to keep it flexible and functional. Unlike the LCSFAs, the longer VLSFAs actually maintain membrane fluidity and stability, which is crucial for proper cellular function. Again, the fluidity is what makes cells able to communicate effectively, transport nutrients, and respond to stress, like a well-oiled hose that allows water to flow smoothly through the hose. By keeping these cellular processes running efficiently, these VLSFAs reduce inflammation and oxidative stress and decrease the risk of cardiovascular outcomes and slow aging down. But the impact of these fats really depends on the type and the context of the consumption. If you're regularly consuming LCSFAs from processed foods and red meat, combined with a sedentary lifestyle, that can be really harmful. However, including small amounts of VLSFAs as a balanced diet rich with fruits and vegetables and unsaturated fats may contribute positively to your overall health. I know this might be pretty confusing because I basically said that saturated fats are bad for you. And that's what the AHA, the American Heart Association, and many other bodies of medicine agree upon. But then I mentioned that there's these specific types of saturated fats that are actually potentially good for you. To make it simple, just remember that saturated fats coming from main sources like fatty red meats, butter, dairy sources, and also from coconut or palm oils are associated with worse outcomes, whereas the stuff coming from fatty fish or from the vegetable type of oils that are liquid at room temperature, those are good for you. They are largely unsaturated fats, but there are a few of these special VLSFAs, which are technically saturated fats, but they seem to be associated. It's a little bit unclear if it's a mechanistic association, so there's something happening that's actually promoting the benefits of these types of saturated fats, or maybe it's just the food matrix. So we forget all the time that we don't process foods as these like little molecules of ingredients that impact our health in a certain way. We take in foods as a whole, and the food matrix actually does matter. So that can lead to a lot of confusion because we do a lot of what I refer to as reductive science when we're doing clinical studies. We're looking at specific tags or associations to very specific definitions. And we kind of lose sight of the entire forest. It's kind of like losing the forest for the trees. Long story short, most saturated fats are not very good for you, and it's bad for your heart health, it's bad for your brain health, and so forth, and it can accelerate aging. But the types of fats coming from fatty fish and from nuts and vegetables tend to be the good fats for you. So let's do a quick review. High intake of saturated fats has been linked to increased cellular senescence and impaired stress resilience. Essentially, your cells are giving up too soon. So imagine if the fats you eat cause your cells to become lazy, refuse to die, and hang around causing trouble. It's almost like that person who drinks too much at your party, eats too much junk food, and lies around on your couch all night and day and doesn't help you out with cleanup or anything like that. So these cells, these zombie cells, they're releasing these harmful vibes, these harmful chemicals, contributing to inflammation and accumulating, making you age faster both inside and out. The saturated fats also impair your stress resilience. So like I mentioned, we face stress every single day, environmental, metabolic, emotional stress. And our cells are typically or evolved to bounce back from these stressors. But diets high in saturated fats make it more difficult for cells to recover. You want to make good dietary choices, and one of them is to replace your saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, such as from the healthy oils we mentioned. I wanted to also include some studies, some actual studies, because I think this is important. It's such an important point to nail home. If you hate studies, just skip this next chapter, but I want to go through the studies because I think it's really important. The evidence in heart health is so strong for avoiding saturated fats that the American Heart Association has repeatedly recommended lowering the intake of saturated fats and replacing them with unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats, to reduce the incidence of cardiovascular disease. And this is based on so much evidence showing that these types of changes can lower your LDL cholesterol, which is a key risk factor for atherosclerosis and heart disease. Remember, you don't want to clog up the arteries that are feeding your heart, your brain, and the rest of your tissues. There are also several large cohort studies that have shown that a higher intake of saturated fatty acids is associated with total as well as the cardiovascular mortality. One study conducted in Norway over 45 years showed that higher saturated fat intake was positively associated, so this is a bad thing, with mortality endpoints, all mortality endpoints. That includes cardiovascular death, but also any kind of death. And another study reported that dietary saturated fat intake was associated with increased all-cause mortality, heart disease mortality, and cerebral vascular disease mortality in an elderly population. These findings indicate that regularly consuming high levels of saturated fats can truly have a significantly bad impact on your lifespan. So, what about accelerated aging? Because we care also about the process of aging itself. So it turns out that high fat diets, those rich in saturated fats, have been linked to increased cellular senescence and impaired stress resilience directly. Cellular senescence is natural, but diets high in saturated fat amplify the burden of dysfunctional cells across multiple organs. A recent study just published this year in 2024 highlighted this. It showed that the senescence burden actually increased as well as the inflammation burden with more saturated fats. And then, like we mentioned, not all saturated fats are created equal. This is a little bit of a detail that confuses a lot of people, but just saying the LCSFAs are associated with the negative outcomes for your heart and mortality. And they cause endothelial cell damage, promote atherosclerosis, and increase heart disease risk. However, the very long chain saturated fatty acids have actually been shown to have potential protective effects associated with reduced risks of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease. There's also this debate between plant-based versus animal-based saturated fats. I've heard out there a lot of times that, it's the saturated fats from the animal sources that are bad, not necessarily from the plants. And there's this whole debate about coconut oil. So I just want to talk about this because it is confusing. It's not straightforward. Nothing's ever black and white when it comes to health. And coconut oil is especially one of those topics which really confuses a lot of people. People really get up in arms about coconut oil. It turns out that saturated fats from plant sources such as coconut oil have a mixed effects, which is why everybody is so mad about it. MCTs, or medium chain triglycerides, may raise the HDL cholesterol, that's a so-called good cholesterol, but it also increases your LDL cholesterol. And we know that LDL cholesterol is so strongly associated with bad cardiovascular outcomes. Studies have shown that replacing both the animal and the plant-based saturated fats with unsaturated fats is generally a good thing and reduces your overall aging burden. So I wanted to talk about a few of the studies. Again, if you hate studies, skip ahead. But I think this is important, especially since there's so much debate about coconut oil. Coconut oil consumption is significantly associated with increased LDL cholesterol. That's an established risk factor for atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. This was shown in a systematic review and meta-analysis showing that coconut oil consumption raised LDL cholesterol by 10.47 milligram per deciliters compared to non-tropical vegetable oil. So basically unsaturated fats. It's so strong that the National Lipid Association, can you believe that there is a National Lipid Association? That's really funny to me, actually. But it just shows that it's a really, really important topic. They also note that the increase in LDL cholesterol from coconut oil is expected to adversely affect atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk. ASCVD is the acronym that you might commonly see. So like I mentioned, coconut oil also does increase HDL cholesterol, but we don't actually know the clinical relevance of this increase. We don't know if it matters. I mean, we used to have these drugs that would increase HDL cholesterol, and we didn't have any sort of positive outcomes. And that's why you don't hear about people taking these drugs, it turns out. The same meta-analysis that I spoke about reported an increase in HDL cholesterol by 4 milligrams per deciliters. However, it does seem that this increase in HDL cholesterol does not offset the adverse effects of the elevated LDL-C. There's also some experimental studies showing that coconut oil can aggravate pressure overload induced cardiomyopathy. So that might be a bit much if you don't know already what cardiomyopathy is. That's basically a problem with the muscles of the heart. And this can increase mortality and worsen cardiac remodeling. This is without inducing any sort of other obvious effects of fat intake. Like, it doesn't induce obesity. It doesn't induce metabolic disorder like systemic insulin resistance. So just the coconut oil alone seems to aggravate this type of heart disease. Oxidative stress. Coconut oil has also been shown to increase oxidative stress. Remember that key mechanism, the rusting, that causes accelerated aging. And that study on cardiomyopathy indicated higher oxidative stress levels in mice fed a coconut oil diet. Coconut oil is especially harmful when you combine it with an overall high-fat diet because it can induce metabolic dysfunctions, adipose inflammation, and hepatic lipid accumulation. So that's liver fat, fatty liver. That's something that we hear about all the time. And these are all associated with accelerated aging. In summary, coconut-based fats are associated with basically negative health outcomes, increased LDL cholesterol, oxidative stress, and inflammation. And this contributes to higher risks of cardiovascular diseases and accelerated aging. I'm preparing myself for all the haters out there because there's so many proponents of coconut oil. And I'm just going to say right up that for some people, coconut oil is going to be less bad for you than for other people. And this is a separate topic, which I'm definitely going to get into because it's so important, but different people absorb fats differently. So I know for myself that I unfortunately absorb these saturated fats in a negative way. There's some other people who simply just don't absorb them or reabsorb them that much in our gut. Lucky you. And I'm very jealous about it because you can eat a lot more of these saturated fats with less harm. So it's genetics. It comes to genetics, and you don't even need to do a genetic test or a specialized test. Sometimes you could just look at your family. I myself, I have such a strong family history of heart disease that I know without even doing any additional testing that I've got to watch out. My dad had a heart attack. My aunt just died of aortic dissection. My grandfather died of a stroke. My grandmother died of sudden cardiac death in her sleep. And it goes on and on. There's so much heart disease in my family. Many families have this unless you're one of the very lucky few who have one of those beneficial genetic mutations. So how does this relate to your everyday life? Let's talk about good choices that you can make, good alternatives you can use. Let's talk about breakfast. Breakfast is easy. If you're reaching for butter to put on your toast or adding full fat cream to your coffee or even eating a few strips of bacon, these foods are so high in saturated fats. And over time, it can really take a serious toll on your body. It ages you. You can make simple swaps. So some things that I like to do. I don't eat breakfast a lot, but I like breakfast for lunch or breakfast for dinner. So you can replace that butter with a drizzle of extra virgin olive oil, or you can put avocado on your toast. I love avocado so much. And then instead of using full fat cream, try using a plant-based milk alternative. So these changes might seem really small, but they can significantly impact your long-term health and how well you age. Your cells will thank you by staying more flexible, resilient, and ready to take on whatever life throws your way. That's just breakfast, but you can make similar choices for lunch and for dinner. So just make sure instead of using butter, reach for olive oil. Olive oil is so amazing. I add it to all of my salads. I add it to my avocado toast. I actually really like this. I've only ever seen it at one Starbucks, but Starbucks started creating these olive oil coffee drinks, and it was so weird and so amazing because it adds a little bit of this delicious texture to the coffee. It makes it a little bit creamier. It doesn't taste super olivey. I was really worried about that. It actually tastes amazing. It does add a few more calories, but I'm not the first person to say, let's just say, that not every single calorie is bad for you. And so I know there's people listening out there who are really, really careful about counting calories, but there is such a thing as a better version of a calorie than others. In olive oil, yes, it is fat, and fats have more calories per gram than other types of macros. But olive oil is so good for you and is so anti-inflammatory that I think it's one of those things that very few people overdo it with olive oil. It wouldn't be a food, health, longevity podcast without talking about sugars. Let's talk about added sugars. Added sugars are obviously sugars that are not naturally occurring in foods, but are added during the processing or the preparation of such foods. These are often refined sugars. Refinement means that they have been extracted and processed from natural sources, like sugarcane or sugar beets, stripping away all the natural nutrients such as the fibers, the vitamins, and the minerals. So I talk about the food matrix a lot because when you eat foods in their natural forms, the more whole foods, it's actually coming with a lot of good stuff. Like fiber is so important, and it comes with a lot of sugary foods in nature, like your fruits and your vegetables. However, when you refine it, you take it out of its food matrix, you're taking it away from all the good stuff and you're just concentrating the sweeteners, which we all love, but unfortunately that means you're missing out on all the positives of these types of foods. You can find refined sugars, added sugars, absolutely everywhere. It's so hard in modern day living to avoid added sugars. It's like seriously one of the worst parts of nutrition coaching that I find, because people are not used to reading labels and they don't even understand all the different names for different added sugars. People will describe them as things like rice sugars. You have to watch out for sucralose. These types of added sweeteners I'm going to talk about in some detail today, but I also am going to make a separate episode about different types of sweeteners as well, because it's actually a pretty complex body of research and a pretty complicated topic. Needless to say, there's added sugars in almost every single packaged food you can imagine. And if you're getting food from a restaurant, it's definitely there. When I was just traveling in Taiwan, which is my home country, I remember thinking, I'm like, my goodness, I did not realize how much sugar there was in absolutely every single dish, including all of the savory dishes. We love sugar in Taiwan, unfortunately. And back in the day, it was because sugar was rare, and of course people love it. So people associated it with wealth and having plenty of food. And so they started adding it to everything. And of course, to this day, we still love our sugar. And Taiwan's the country that we have boba drinks from, those pearl milk teas. And all of those tapioca balls, those are starch balls. And a cup full of boba is as many carbs as an entire bowl of white rice. Both are not very good for you. And unfortunately, both are part of my native culture. Unfortunately, fortunately, I mean, at least we know now and we can sort of make changes. Although it's really, really hard when you're traveling in certain countries and you don't know where to find alternatives. And that brings us back to the foods all around us. So even in so-called healthy foods like granola bars, smoothies, and yogurts, there's so many added sugars. So I just want to clue in people before we dive deeply into that you have to pay really close attention to ingredient lists and also the nutrition part at the back of your foods, because so many things that you would otherwise think of as healthy have way too much sugar added to them. I remember I was looking for Greek yogurts and I was like, oh my goodness, all of these yogurts, they have like 5 grams, 10 grams of added sugar. That's like more than 10% of the added sugar. No amount of added sugar is good for you, but that's a supposed 10% of the amount of added sugar you should have, according to somebody who decided that for the nutrition label. You can think of added sugars, they're like this charismatic party guest. We're going back to the party. They're fun at first, but then they cause chaos. They make everything taste sweeter and more enjoyable in the moment, but afterwards you totally regret them. They're like a toxic friend, a toxic partner, a toxic whatever, coworker. So they're causing havoc for your body's health. Again, natural sugars come with fruit. Natural sugars in fruits and vegetables come with fiber, vitamins, and antioxidants. But refined added sugars are stripped of nutrients during processing, and that leaves behind just empty calories. And that is a huge burden to your body, both for health and for aging. So added sugars accelerate your aging in several ways, primarily by increasing oxidative stress, promoting glycation, remember those AGEs, and causing inflammation. So remember, oxidative stress, rust forming in the cells of your body. When you consume added sugars, your body undergoes a series of reactions that lead to the production of free radicals. Free radicals are those unstable molecules that cause damage to your cells. So it's like having too much sugar fuels an internal rusting process and weakens your cells, makes them age faster. These free radicals are villains. They damage your proteins, your fats, and even your DNA, contributing to accelerated aging and an increased risk of chronic disease. Every time you add a little bit more sugar, think of every single gram of added sugar as a rust accelerant to your body's internal machinery. It turns a well-oiled gear to a creaky, worn-down parts. So that's why people who consume high amounts of added sugars experience more rapid signs of aging. You can even see it. You can see it in wrinkles in the skin, reduced skin elasticity, but you can feel it as well. People get more fatigue if you have too many carbs and too many added sugars. So one of the most destructive processes linked to added sugar intake is actually protein glycation. This leads to the formation of the advanced glycation end products, AGEs. Sugar molecules, when they bind to proteins in their bodies, they form these AGEs, which damage the skin and internal organs. AGEs, it's the same process essentially as like that sticky caramelization that happens, like the golden crust of a creme brulee or the gooey topping on a sticky toffee pudding. But imagine that instead of a dessert, it's happening inside your body. So AGEs will make your proteins stiff and less functional. And in your skin, for example, they damage the collagen and elastin, leading to sagging and wrinkles. None of us want that. So internally, it's doing that too. So it's not just cosmetic. Your skin is a sign of what's happening internally much of the time. So internally, AGEs can harm tissues and organs, contributing to problems like stiff arteries and kidney damage. So it's turning your body's proteins into a piece of overcooked, tough meat. Let's talk about insulin resistance. Of course, added sugars can also lead to insulin resistance. So this is a condition that is so bad for us, and it's where your body cells stop responding properly to insulin. Insulin is that hormone produced by your pancreas that helps regulate blood sugar levels. And it's necessary because we don't want too much sugar just hang out in our bloodstream. And we also want sugar to go to proper storage places or to your muscles to be used for exercise, to your brain, for example. These are all good places for sugar to go. But unfortunately, insulin, especially at high levels, is really bad for your health and for aging. Why does the insulin resistance happen? So imagine if you're constantly overloading your body, your system, with sugar. Eventually, your cells get tired of the constant barrage, that nagging, and stop letting insulin do its job. It's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. Your body stops responding to insulin because it's overwhelmed by all these sugar and insulin spikes. This insulin resistance contributes to this vicious cycle of increased blood sugar levels, more insulin production, and greater fat storage. And over time, this not only leads to weight gain, but also a higher risk of metabolic disorder like diabetes, prediabetes, and all the variations of that fatty liver. And this all accelerates aging by damaging your blood vessels, your nerve endings, and your tissues. So it's like running an engine with the wrong fuel. In fact, running an engine with like syrup. So eventually it'll lead to a major breakdown. So refined sugars, particularly those in sugar sweetened beverages and added sugars, have really significant adverse effects on health and aging. And additionally, artificial sweeteners have complex effects on health and aging with both potential benefits and risks. So I want to talk about this in some detail because it gets really confusing. People, again, get all up in arms on social media and on the internet. And so I think it's really important that we address this in some detail so you understand why people say the things that they do and why certain people are really confused. Let's talk about heart disease. High intake of refined sugars is associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease in all-cause mortality. That means death from any reason. So each 250 milliliter per day increment of a sugar-sweetened beverage is linked to 17% higher risk of coronary heart disease. That's what causes MIs or heart attacks, and also a 4% higher risk of all-cause mortality, death of any reason. Higher consumption of artificial sweeteners, particularly aspartame, acesulfame, potassium, and sucralose, is also associated with increased risks of cardiovascular disease, including the heart attacks and also strokes, cerebrovascular disease. Metabolic disorders, obviously, are also deeply, deeply tied to sugar intake. So chronic consumption of added sugars, especially added fructose. So remember, this is added fructose. This isn't necessarily the fructose that comes naturally in fruits, which is tied to fibers. This can lead to metabolic alterations such as increased oxidative stress, protein glycation, remember the AGEs, and inflammation, dyslipidemia, that means too much bad cholesterol, bad lipids, and insulin resistance, metabolic disorder. These metabolic changes are precursors to the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, hypertension, that's high blood pressure, and also type 2 diabetes. So frequent consumption of artificial sweeteners like aspartame, sucralose, and saccharin has also been linked to increased risks of metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, so forth, heart disease. And this is thought to occur through interference with the glucose and energy homeostasis. It turns out that you don't need to even have calories involved for artificial sweeteners to cause their damage. Even the taste of sweetness on your tongue can sometimes trigger some of these effects. It can cause a little bit of an insulin bump in some cases. The effects are far, far less in terms of that cephalic response. So I don't want to get the whole story wrong for people. It's still less than having the actual sugars that are caloric and causing these effects. But artificial sweeteners have additional risk and harms for things like your gut microbiome. So we've talked about the gut microbiome in other episodes, but it is so important. And we're starting to get more and more evidence that it may be the key to really great health and longevity. Artificial sweeteners really mess with your healthy gut flora, and that can worsen glycemic control. Fructose intake is also associated with a 22% increased risk of pancreatic cancer for every single 25 gram per day increment. Neuropsychiatric disorders, excessive sugar intake is linked to higher risks of dementia. So those in the highest category of sugar intake have twice the risk of developing dementia compared to those in the lowest category, or the lowest quintile. It's divided up as quintiles. So excessive sugar intake is linked to higher risk of dementia. Aging effect, sorry if this is repeating a little bit, because some of the same studies are associated for different disease states as well as for aging. So we do know from studies that high chronic intake of added sugars accelerates the aging process by increasing that oxidative stress, protein glycation, and inflammation. These contribute to age-related diseases like neurodegenerative diseases, sarcopenia, that's a loss of muscle, and also osteoporosis, so bone density decrease. The long-term consumption of artificial sweeteners can also cause premature cellular senescence, contributing to accelerated aging. This can impair the functional and structural properties of high-density lipoproteins, HDL, and leading to atherosclerosis, that clogging of your arteries that leads to things like heart attacks and stroke. Frailty is also deeply associated with higher consumption of added sugars. So it turns out that people eating over 36 grams per day of added sugars are more likely to develop frailty compared to those consuming less than 15 grams per day of added sugars. Cancer survivors have even some negative outcomes associated with high intake of sugar. So it turns out that high intake of sugar and sugar-sweetened beverages is linked to premature aging in adult survivors of childhood cancer. And that's indicated by an increased risk of age-related chronic health conditions. So lifespan is something that's tough to study in humans because we live for a really long time, but we have a lot of model organisms that we conduct studies for. And it turns out that studies in C. elegans, which is a type of worm that we use a lot for studies, have shown that certain artificial sweeteners, such as saccharin, can shorten lifespan and impair exercise capacity. Acesulfame, potassium, which is another artificial sweetener, can also have some variable effects. High intake of sugar, sweetened beverages is linked to all sorts of aging and all of these different types of studies. So whether it's a refined sugar itself or an artificial sugar, we want to be careful. It's potentially damaging for our heart health, our brain health, metabolic function, cancer risk, neuropsychiatric health, and generally aging overall. I get this question a lot, so I wanted to address it briefly, but I will be doing a separate episode on the topic of artificial sweeteners. There are some alternative sweeteners that may be less harmful, although the may may also be due to it just being fewer studies overall on them. So I still urge caution when you're going for these artificial sweeteners. In studies, erythritol, xylitol, and D-allulose seem to have more favorable metabolic outcomes compared to refined sugars and artificial sweeteners. So these replicate the benefits of sugars, such as the sweetness and GI hormone release, without the detrimental effects on health. There are, however, some recent studies showing that erythritol might increase the risk of cardiovascular events by enhancing platelet reactivity. That can lead to more clotting. So that does raise some concern about its safety. So there's also new studies coming out, and I'm trying to keep an eye on them all the time, but this changes. This is something that we have to keep an eye out on. Stevia, steviol glycosides, otherwise known as stevia, have also demonstrated a lack of adverse effects on endothelial cells and don't seem to compromise cardiovascular health. They're actually associated with improved insulin sensitivity and decreased weight gain in animal models. There's also natural sweeteners, which, because they're natural, we tend to feel that they seem to be better for us. But sweeteners are still sweeteners, so keep that in mind. Maple syrup, molasses, agave syrup. So these natural sweeteners have been shown to attenuate, so lessen the development of insulin resistance and hepatic inflammation compared to sucrose, table sugar, in animal studies. So they might be less harmful in the context of obesity. But remember, they are still sugars, they're still calories, they still lead to some sort of damage. They might just be slightly less bad. In summary, there are some somewhat less harmful artificial sweeteners like stevia, maybe erythritol, maybe xylitol, and allulose, but they're not without risks. Reducing sugar consumption can really have a significant impact on your visible aging, but also your internal aging and overall health. People who cut back on their added sugars really do notice improvements in their skin, such as reduced acne, fewer wrinkles, and an overall healthier glow. And this is because a lower intake of sugar reduces inflammation and formation of AGEs and allows the body to repair itself more effectively. And the insides of our body react similarly. People report having way more energy and sleeping better, having better mood. So I know sugars are so tempting in the short term because it really triggers that part of our brain that's addictive. So people who eat more carbs will eat more carbs. It's one of those vicious cycles. So if you cut it in half, cut that loop, then you're actually more likely to not depend on sugars in the future. So that's a good thing. Just keep that in mind. Our bodies can be hijacked by sugar, and we want to take away that harmful temptation, that harmful trigger. And the more you take away, the less tempting it will be. If your body is that dream car, the only car you will ever have, that only home you will ever live in, you want to use high quality fuel, not sludge. Otherwise, you're going to break down faster. So switch to higher quality fuel, more whole foods, fewer added sugars to allow your body to perform at its best and keep its engine running smoothly for many, many years. You will see the benefits and you'll feel the benefits. I always say it's not all just hypothetical. It's not just lectures from a doctor. It really is something that you can feel almost immediately in the first week or two of starting a new diet. By understanding what's hiding in our foods, we really can empower ourselves to make better decisions for promoting our health, longevity, and vitality. I'm going to be talking about this topic again in part 2. We only scratched the surface today with saturated fats and added sugars. If you found today's discussion insightful, subscribe to the podcast. I am Hillary Lynn, MD, on all of the platforms. Until then, stay tuned and stay healthy.